It's draft week, and buzz is growing about one specific prospect being the Jets' potential pick at 10. That and other developments today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, April 22nd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, it is draft week. The draft is just 3 days away. We will have the first round Thursday night, and there's a lot of buzz about what the New York Jets may or may not do with the 10th overall pick. And there's one specific prospect who keeps coming up over and over and over. Let's talk about that on today's show. And of course, you probably know that the prospect I'm talking about is Georgia tight end Brock Bowers. And Joe Douglas on Friday, in comments to the media, did nothing to slow down the momentum of the idea that the Jets are very interested in Bowers. He was asked about Bowers. He had some very complimentary things to say. He called Bowers a tight end that is a Swiss Army knife that can move the ball around the formation and really stress the defense. He made favorable comparisons to Sam Laporta of last year. He said if that tight end can be someone that is turned into what Kansas City, San Francisco, what Laporta did last year in Detroit. Those are dynamic weapons for your offense and guys that put stress on your defense because they create mismatches. And Douglas also said, I love our tight end room, actually, talking about the current tight end room that includes guys like Tyler Conklin and Jeremy Ruckert. But he said, again, like that question about wide receiver, if there's a chance to add more dynamic players, we're going to take a look at it. So Douglas doing nothing to slow down the momentum of Brock Bowers to the Jets, although, of course, a couple of days before the draft, the GM is going to throw compliments out to every prospect. You know, that could be a smokescreen. That said, Rich Cimini of ESPN, a Jets insider, in his weekly Sunday morning article, also suggested that the buzz he's hearing is that the Jets are likely to pick Bowers if they stay at 10. He mentioned they are also interested in offensive tackles like Joe Alt, Fuaga, and a couple other guys. But all indications are right now that it sounds like the Jets are focused on Bowers at 10. Cimini also quoted Dan Jeremiah of NFL Network, who worked with Douglas and who's really had a good sense for who the Jets would be interested in since Douglas took over. And I'm not sure whether that's because, he and Douglas are close. I'm not sure that's because Douglas is necessarily giving him information. Jeremiah and Douglas came up together with the Baltimore Ravens. They both worked in the Baltimore front office. So, it may not be that Douglas is telling Jeremiah what he wants to do, but because these guys were trained the same way as they were coming up, Jeremiah kind of has a sense of how Douglas thinks. And Jeremiah indicated, he said his gut tells him that Douglas would pick Bowers over a lineman. And then ESPN's Mark Dominic is also cited, a former Tampa Bay Buccaneers general manager, says, I don't think Brock Bowers makes it to the Jets, but if he does, I'm not taking any phone calls. I'm just sending the card up. So plenty of buzz about the Jets potentially picking Bowers. And I think, one thing we can say is that since Douglas took over as the Jets GM, this has not been a team that's really hidden its intentions. Back in 2021, everybody knew the Jets were drafting Zach Wilson. In 2022, it broke late, like it broke the week of the draft. But the first 3-4 months of the offseason, you didn't really hear a lot about Sauce Gardner. But then, like a few days before the drafting, it just got everywhere. The Jets would take drafting Sauce Gardner if he made it to the 4th overall pick. And then last year, we don't know for a fact the Jets would have picked Broderick Jones, but certainly seemed that way based on the way things played out. We certainly think New England and Pittsburgh thought the Jets were drafting Broderick Jones because they worked out a trade for the Steelers to jump the Jets for Jones. So the Jets have not exactly been a team that have really hidden their intentions all that much during the Douglas era. This could be a smokescreen. Look, this could be the rare instance. This could be like the Jets turning over a new leaf. We know they have some guys that departed their front office, but if history holds, it certainly sounds like there's a pretty good chance the Jets are going to draft Brock Bowers at 10 if he's there. Although Cimini also did indicate that there's a possibility the Jets could look to trade up for a wide receiver. And a lot of buzz about the Jets potentially moving up to 8 with Atlanta to try and get Rome Odunze if he falls there. And, what Douglas laid out, I think a lot of what he said is true. The issue with the tight end position is that there really aren't many great players at the tight end position. And unlike a spot like wide receiver, at wide receiver, you can get a good guy. A good guy's going to get you 1,000 yards a year. You need a great tight ends to get you 1,000 yards a year. A guy who's like a middle of the pack tight end, it doesn't really make a big difference. Like Tyler Conklin's. I think it's fair to say Tyler Conklin's like a middle of the pack type tight end. You could make a case maybe he's a little higher. You can make a case he's a little bit lower. But if you look at the way the Jets offense functions, how big of a difference did Tyler Conklin really make last year? How many more games are you going to win with someone like Tyler Conklin at tight end versus Ryan Griffin? That's not to knock Conklin. It's just to say that the tight end position is really not one that moves the needle unless you have an elite level talent. And of course, there are lots of very good teams who have elite tight ends. Kansas City has Travis Kelce. San Francisco has George Kittle. Last year, Sam Laporta had an excellent rookie season for Detroit, Baltimore, and Mark Andrews. So, the final four teams last year all had good tight ends. Is that a sign you need a great tight end to win in this league? No, but it's a sign that great tight ends are mismatches. Guys who are built like linebackers but run close to as fast as wide receivers run. They're real weapons. They're very difficult to match up with. And, if Bowers is as good as advertised, and, there are lots of people who think Bowers is the best tight end prospect in decades. If he actually is that good, he could be a guy who is very much worth drafting for the Jets. As we've been over, though, on the show, my concern is about the accuracy of tight end scouting, because I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, the NFL as a whole, and most teams don't scout that differently from one another. Most teams kind of use a lot of the same scouting processes. In fact, it's so similar that a lot of teams pool their resources to do advanced scouting. Guys that are like going to be drafted in a year or two, a lot of teams just pool their resources and like they'll have one scout write reports for a number of different teams. And I think we've seen through recent history, the NFL frequently, every couple of years, there's some tight end prospect is viewed as a transcendent prospect. And the guy gets drafted. And typically, the guy's a pretty good player. Vernon Davis was a pretty good player. If you go all the way back to 2006, Eric Ebron had some good seasons with Detroit, about a decade ago. Kyle Pitts, he's been a pretty decent player with Atlanta. I mean, every couple of years, there's like some tight end prospect who's supposed to be like the next great tight end in the league. And usually they don't live up to the hype. And I think that this speaks to the difficulty of separating the good from the great. And I think it's true at the tight end position, but I think it's true in other spots. I raised a statistic recently that, if you look at players who have made multiple all-pro teams who have been drafted since the year 2000, in the first round, there are just as many who have been drafted after 10 as there have been drafted in the top 10. The league is pretty good at figuring out who the good players are. They're not good at separating the good from the great, though. And at the tight end position, again, you have to be great to make a difference. The middle of the pack tight end, it doesn't really matter. You don't really get much from having the middle of the pack tight end versus having a bottom tier tight end. You do get something from having a great tight end. And I think that, when you're talking about Bowers, if you're talking about drafting him in the top 10, there's probably going to be like an element of luck involved. And what I mean from that is that, again, it's difficult to separate the good from the great. So there are elements here that suggest Bowers could be great. And of course, if he is great, if he is on that level of, the guys Douglas mentioned, that's some pretty lofty comparisons Douglas is making when you're talking about, a future Hall of Famer in Travis Kelce and a future Hall of Famer in George Kittle and a guy in Sam Laporta who had an excellent rookie season. That's a lot to ask out of a rookie tight end. It's a lot to ask out of getting great production's a lot to ask out of any rookie, but especially at the tight end position because of how much there is to learn. You've got to learn the blocking, you've got to learn the receiving, you've got to learn the routes from in line, you got to learn the routes from the slot, you got to learn the routes from outside. You have to essentially learn all the wide receiver positions, then add an extra wide receiver position or two, and then learn blocking schemes. There's a lot on your plate at the tight end position. And I think I also look at the Jets situation right now where you have a couple of tackles who are 33 years old in the final year of their contract. And, if the Jets are in this position where they can draft the second best tackle prospect of this year's class, it's something you have to consider. But it certainly does look like the Jets are, at least, unless, again, this could be a smokescreen. This could be the Jets just throwing stuff out there to try and throw us all off the scent. But at this point, I think, it looks like Brock Bowers is the favorite if he's there at 10. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the quarterback position. Of course, the Jets have Aaron Rodgers starting this year. They're not going to draft a quarterback early, but there could be some developments lower on the depth chart, and we'll get to them as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel's your place to bet on every game. And right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Exciting time in New York. Again, the hockey playoffs, Rangers and Islanders both in action. You also have the NBA playoffs. Knicks off to a great start in their series against the Philadelphia 76ers. You have baseball. Yankees off to a very good start. And, well, Mets, maybe not so much, but who knows? Maybe they can turn it around. A little renaissance in New York sports happening right now. And FanDuel's the place to get in on the action. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. You get $150 win or lose. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monopoly Go. We've all been there either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep, you lift up your head, and you say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. Of course, I'm talking about the smash hit game, Monopoly Go. It's a great mobile game. It lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. You can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. You can charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends if you want to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go. Now free on the App Store or Google Play. Again, it's Monopoly Go. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. If you're a fan of Locked On Jets, you should also know that the Locked On NFL mock draft is available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who the local Locked On experts are picking for every NFL franchise, including me, with live reactions from local college football experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL mock draft available now on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today on Locked On Jets, we're focused on draft week. The NFL draft is just a couple of days away. Of course, it's not just about the draft picks the Jets may be selecting, though, that we're focused on. We're also focused on a potential Zach Wilson trade. The Jets have made it pretty clear that they're moving on from Zach Wilson after 3 unsuccessful seasons. The Jets, of course, tried to bench Zach Wilson last year, and that lasted all of 4 plays. After Aaron Rodgers went down, Zach Wilson resumed his role as starting quarterback for the Jets, and things just did not go very well. And I think for all parties involved, a change of scenery might be the best thing. I think it certainly would be the best thing for Zach Wilson. I think it's going bad here in New York. Zach Wilson, probably is never going to get a fair shake with the fan base or the media at this point. I think, or maybe a better way to put it is just that I think everybody's moved on. I think everybody's turned the page. I don't think there's anything productive that can come from Zach Wilson remaining in New York because he's such a lightning rod. If he has to go back into the lineup, people are going to be inclined to be frustrated with him. It's just not a situation that's conducive to Zach Wilson growing. Look, Zach Wilson has a very, very long road ahead of him. It's going to be a very high mountain for him to climb to be a successful quarterback, to go on to have a successful career, because he's just not really close to where he needs to be a good quarterback. But if it's going to happen, it probably would behoove him to get a clean start somewhere else. But the Jets have been unable to trade him so far, and reports have indicated that a big part of that is the salary. The new team would have to take on $5.5 million of salary. So also in the report we mentioned from Rich Cimini yesterday, he talked about Brock Bowers. He talked about some other topics, including Zach Wilson. And Cimini mentioned that the Jets are waiting for a team that's willing to take on part of that $5.5 million salary. And that's probably the reason the trade hasn't been made yet, because I think the deadline for a trade is probably this coming Saturday. Now, that's not necessarily to say like the Jets absolutely have to trade Zach Wilson, but it's the most logical time for him to be traded, because the Jets can afford to wait on a deal right now, because there's nothing really lost by having Zach Wilson take up a roster spot. If he's not going to be on the team this year, the cap number is not as significant, and the Jets can wait. I think Saturday, the reason I view Saturday as kind of like the soft deadline is that's the last point where the Jets can get compensation for this year. If we're talking draft picks. And I think we're all assuming the Jets are going to probably get a draft pick, or there's going to be some sort of pick swap in exchange for Zach Wilson. If it's going to be a 2024 pick, well, day 3 of the draft is this coming Saturday. So that's why it's a logical point, and that's the point where the Jets are probably just going to have to give up on the idea of some other team taking a chunk of the salary. Jets are probably going to have to eat most of Zach Wilson's salary to facilitate a trade. And look, I'm sure they'll be able to trade him. Zach Wilson is good enough to be on a 53-man roster somewhere. If he's a number 2 or number 3 quarterback, I mean, he's better than some of the quarterbacks out there. He's had at least had a couple of good games. Maybe not starting level material at this point, but a guy who is at least good enough to be on an NFL roster. I think someone will take him if the compensation is going to be small. If you don't have to pay him that much money, if the Jets are going to eat most of the salary, and if the draft compensation in a trade is not going to be very big, I think it's probably going to happen then. But until then, the Jets are probably just going to wait, holding on hope that some team's going to take Zach Wilson's salary off their hands. I mean, I'm very skeptical because every team knows this. I don't think Zach Wilson's a hot commodity right now. I don't think there are many teams that are desperate to trade for Zach Wilson. It's one of those situations where if the price is right, maybe you take him on, maybe just take a bet on him. If you had him regarded very highly as a prospect a couple of years ago, and you don't have to give up anything to get him, and he's not going to cost you anything, you take him on. But I don't think any teams out there are going to be busting down the Jets' doors trying to get Zach Wilson. So I think we're probably looking at Saturday for a trade, and the question then becomes who's going to replace Zach Wilson on the roster. Joe Douglas had some comments about that last week, and one of the things Douglas said was, I was going back and looking at some drafts and the way teams handled the quarterback position. I went back and looked at how the Packers of the 90s, you draft a guy like Mark Brunell in the 5th round in 93, then you draft Matt Hasselbeck in the 6th round in 98. They were a quarterback farm when Brett Favre was there, Aaron Brooks in 99, and then they drafted Aaron Rodgers in the 1st round in 2005. I'd love to be a quarterback factory like that. I would love to have quarterbacks that we take every year in the draft. Even if you hit on 2 or 3 like the Packers did, you can really turn those into future picks, or they develop into starters elsewhere like Mark Brunell, Aaron Brooks, and Hasselbeck all did. So Douglas talking about what's known as the Ron Wolf method of quarterback drafting. Ron Wolf was the Packers general manager in the 1990s, and he was famous for drafting a quarterback every single year. And his philosophy was that you can never have too much depth at the quarterback position. And, so essentially the Packers drafted a quarterback every single year. And it was interesting because they actually had the most durable quarterback of all time in Brett Favre. So they never needed to use any of these backups. But a lot of the guys the Packers drafted in the 90s developed into quality starters elsewhere, the players Douglas mentioned. A couple interesting thoughts about that. Number one is I think it's a good idea. I think it's something the Jets haven't done. And it's interesting to hear Douglas say this because there have been a couple of years where the Jets have had a surplus of draft capital. And it would have been very logical to take a late round quarterback and try and develop him. In 2021, I know they drafted Zach Wilson 2nd overall, but they easily could have drafted a quarterback in the late rounds to develop as a longer term backup for Zach. 2022, they had a lot of extra draft capital. And they gave a lot of it away through trade ups, but they easily could have drafted a quarterback in 2022. Last year, they didn't draft a quarterback. So, it's kind of interesting to hear Douglas say this because it's gone very much contrary to what he's done as general manager. And the other aspect of this is it's not like Ron Wolf's quarterback method from the 90s is some obscure fact in NFL history. It's very well known. I'm sure Douglas knew about it before the last couple of weeks. So interesting to hear that. I think it's a good idea. I think, when you're talking about drafting a quarterback, it's kind of like a penny stock. The odds of it hitting are not very good, but if you do hit on it, it really has it can really have an outsized impact on your team. So I believe in the Ron Wolf quarterback method. I believe in drafting a quarterback every year. There's a quarterback like Brock Purdy comes around maybe once in a decade. You can't expect to find like a higher end starter in the 7th round every single year. But if you keep trying, if you keep doing it year after year after year, maybe you hit on somebody. Maybe you hit on a quality backup. And so it certainly sounds like the Jets are going to draft a quarterback day 3 this year. I'm all for that because while the odds of hitting are low, when you do hit, it has an enormous impact on your football team. And, I wish Douglas had been doing that. And look, I don't know that Douglas doing that in the past necessarily would have paid dividends for the Jets. It's very difficult to hit on a quarterback, but it's been noticeable to me how the Jets have not been focused on trying to add quarterbacks in the late round, taking a shot on somebody. And I think it also needs to be said, the other aspect here is that the Packers had Mike Holmgren as their head coach in the 1990s. Holmgren was the best quarterbacks coach of his era, best coach of developing quarterbacks of his era. I don't think Nathaniel Hackett exactly is in the same class as Holmgren, but I still think the Jets should take a shot. I still think this is an area where the Jets need to be more aggressive. You can't fix your quarterback room long term unless you actually try and address your quarterback room long term. And I don't think the Jets have been doing that enough recently. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're actually going to turn our attention away from the draft. Sauce Gardner made some interesting comments on a podcast recently about how he's going to be deployed next season. They drew some attention. I'm not sure they're as big of a deal as people are making it out to be, though. We'll discuss why as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. Now, I have not bought Major League Baseball tickets myself on Game Time, but I've used it for plenty of other events. I used it last summer to go to the U.S. Open last-minute tickets. I needed to find one. It was so easy. I just pulled out the app, a couple of clicks, I was there. A great price. I've done it for a Broadway show. I've done it for the Holiday Bowl out in San Diego during the last holiday season. Every single time I found an amazing deal at the last minute and had the tickets delivered to me immediately. It was so easy to use. I just couldn't get it, and I couldn't get over the prices. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. Let's turn our attention now away from the NFL draft and to Sauce Gardner. Sauce Gardner has been an outstanding young corner for the Jets. Already within 2 years has become one of the top corners in the NFL. In fact, a strong case can be made. Sauce Gardner is already the best corner in the NFL. The Jets have not really deployed him, though, the way a lot of other teams deploy their number one corner. Sauce Gardner has not typically followed the other team's best receiver around the field during his 2 seasons in the NFL. And it's kind of a philosophical thing. People complain about it when the Jets have a rough game, but there's something to be said for the idea of you just stick your bet, you stick a corner in the spot he's comfortable at. The Jets defense is really built on simplicity. And the reason it's built on simplicity, if you see guys coming at you from the same angles every single play, you eventually intuitively understand how to react. Your instincts become better. There's an argument to be made either way. You could also argue that you send your best corner against the other team's best player to try and erase him. That's what the Jets did under Rex Ryan with Darrelle Revis. Well, Sauce Gardner recently on a podcast indicated the Jets are going to start having him shadow more frequently next season. And this has the fan base very happy, because a lot of people, I think no matter what you do, people will complain that you don't do the opposite. Like if the Jets had Sauce shadowing the other team's best receiver, I imagine there are people who would be saying he should just stick to one spot so he gets used to, again, what I mentioned, the angles that you have to play, so you intuitively understand your role better. But this has been greeted with some cheers. I don't think it's as big of a deal, though. First of all, the Jets defense was really good last year. It's not like the Jets defense was bad. I can think of maybe like one game where it would have made a difference to have Sauce shadow the other team's best receiver. That would be the December game in Miami where Jalen Waddle destroyed DJ Reed and Tyreek Hill wasn't playing. So I mean, that would have been the one game, but the Jets got crushed in that game anyway. It's not like that would have won the game for the Jets. Jets couldn't do anything on offense in that game, and the Jets defensive issues in that game went well beyond Jalen Waddle versus DJ Reed. The other aspect of this is DJ Reed, really good number 2 corner. Now, if you have a very weak number one, if you have a very weak number 2 corner, a very strong number 1 corner, you typically have your top corner shadow the other team's best receiver. If you trust your number 2 corner, it's not as imperative. In fact, in 2009, when Lito Shepherd was the Jets' number 2 corner, they had Revis shadow the other team's best receiver. They did that less after Antonio Cromartie came. In fact, the Jets, to the extent the Jets shadowed after Cromartie came, it was more of a stylistic thing because Cromartie was better against vertical threats. He was better against speedy guys who got down the field. So if another team had like a physical possession receiver and a deep threat, a guy who was speedy, Revis typically shadowed the physical possession receiver, even if he was the number 2 guy, and Cromartie shadowed the deep threat. So even in that sense, it's not as big of a deal. And the third issue here is the Jets play a lot of zone, and when you play zone, shadowing matters less, because you may start out with the other team's number 1 receiver across from you, but if the guy runs out of your zone, you're not going to cover him. So, yes, you'll end up taking the other team's number 1 receiver more. Obviously there will be instances where the other team's number 1 receiver is in your zone, but the Jets play so much zone, especially on early downs. Now on third down, they mix it up a little bit more. You'll see more man-to-man. You'll see more blitzes where your guys are on an island, but it's not as big of a deal, I think, as people are making this out to be. And I think, again, the number 1 reason for this is that Jets defense is already really good. I mean, for all the complaints people have about the Jets defense, it's still a top-notch unit. I think part of the issue is that expectations got to an unrealistic point last year where people were expecting to be the number 1 unit in the league. And, DJ Reed made that comment about, trying to match the 85 Bears, which was never very realistic. I mean, the 85 Bears, they've been the best modern defense in the NFL. It may have been the best defense, in the last 40 years. saying your defense is going to reach those heights was never terribly realistic. And I think maybe that set expectations a little too high for the fan base. But the Jets defense is really good, and I mean, we're talking about little tweaks here or there. If we're talking about improving it, we're talking about little moves here or there. And I guess you could argue Sauce following the other team's best receiver more frequently. Maybe that's a little tweak that could improve things a little bit. But I don't think we're talking night and day here. And I don't think the fact that Jets have shadowed so infrequently is as big of a deal as people make it out to be, because most week the Jets are locking down the other team's top receiver, and DJ Reed did it frequently. DJ Reed is an outstanding number 2 corner. He's a type of corner you can trust against most number 1 receivers, and he's going to hold up pretty well. I mean, DJ Reed will be the number 1 corner on a lot of teams in this league. So, one of those things that generated some headlines. Some people, are acting like it's a big deal. I don't think it's a big deal because there's only so much better the Jets defense can get. I mean, it's a good thing. We're not talking about trying to fix a bad defense. We're talking about just a little subtle move here or there that's going to make an already good defense perhaps a little bit better. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.